for me, I like to ask questions as they come up. If I have to hold them to the end, I don't necessarily always remember exactly how I wanted to articulate it. So I can't see the chat, but Teresa's going to help me and let me know when there's questions. So let's get started. So the first slide. Sorry, the next slide. Sorry. There. Okay. Oh, how about, yeah, there we are. Okay, we were already on the agenda in the next slide. Sorry, that's my bad. I should have told you we're on the agenda. Can you do the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so just a little information about Kirtland Air Force Base. If you're not familiar, the Albuquerque area, I know, you know, living in this community for a long time, I knew the base was over there, but I didn't really know a lot about what happened over there. So just for your knowledge, basically here at Kirtland, our major mission is looking at nuclear readiness. We also support in the operations for American Air Power, obviously, as the Air Force, but nuclear readiness is a big mission for us. It falls into three major categories. Not only are we supporting operations for air power, but we also have a training unit on base. We have actually several training units on base, as well as looking at the nuclear. There's a lot of people that are employed at Kirtland. Currently, we have about 20,000 active duty civilians, Guard and Reserve personnel, and the base is absolutely huge. So we have about 51,558 acres, going all the way from like the Gibson, Louisiana area, all the way up into the mountains. Next slide. So these are some affiliations that we have on base. Department of Energy has offices on base, Sandia Labs. There's a research laboratory, the Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Center, Inspection Agency. They're the ones that go everywhere and all the bases and inspect their units, make sure that they're compliant with their policies and procedures. And then the Air Force Safety Center, they're the ones that get called out a lot of times if there's some type of accident, they go and investigate. And then as far as our operations, we also have the 58th Special Wings operation on base. They really provide a lot of the maintenance for our aircraft. The 150th Special Operations Wing, that's the New Mexico Air National Guard. And then, like I said before, we have training. So we have the U.S. Air Force Pararescue School. Those are the guys that jump out of the planes. Lots of training involved with them, and we house them on base as well. So next slide. All right, so I'm gonna just do a disclaimer here and let you know that I'm not as familiar with the other bases. But I wanted to make sure to, you know, provide that information to you all. So Holloman Air Force Base, that's located in Alamogordo. Their mission is to support national security objectives by deploying worldwide to support peacetime and wartime contingencies. Their employment looks about like 21,000. They have active duty, Guard, Reserve, retirees, DOD civilians. They also have a lot of acres at 59,000. Just nice little fact, if you didn't know, that they're home to the world's longest, about 10 miles and fastest approaching, 10,000 feet per second track. And that is, again, why they support the NASA space shuttle. So they're an alternate runway if they need it for any kind of space shuttles to land there because of that long runway. Okay, next slide. All right, so Cannon Air Force Base, this is their mission. They're the 27th Special Operation Wings. They are located in Clovis. Their mission is to provide for the nation's specialized air power. They're capable across the spectrum of conflict, anytime, any place, anywhere. They're the ones that come up with that mission. They are more like training a lot over there as well. They want to make sure that they're ready to execute at any point. In case we have to go to war or whatever the circumstances are. They are investing in the resiliency of our force, the family and relationships. Really, Clovis is kind of a more isolated base, and so they do a lot more, you know, to make sure that the services that the members need are in place for them. All right, next slide. All right, so They don't have as much right there in the Clovis area, only 3,700, but 25 miles away from them, they have the Melrose Air Force Range, which actually occupies 2,500 square miles of airspace that they can use for training. So like I said, that base, really a lot of people go there for different trainings. Then they have about 5,800 military and civilian personnel. All right, so in case you're not familiar with, you know, active duty and military culture in general, you know, like any organization with a history, the military has its own culture, it has its own language in conducting business. And working with individuals in the military, it's important to have a general understanding of the military and the culture. Military is all about rank. Rank is about responsibility and leadership. So the higher rank you are, the more responsibilities you have. Military is also very much about chain of command. Each military unit has a clear chain of command that is from the moment they go to basic training, that is enforced learning on them over and over and over again. The chain of command is based solely on their rank. So depending on how high rank they are, depends on where they fall in the chain. There's the officers, and that's also the NCOs, and they have a lot of, the officers will have more responsibility for the unit as a whole, and then the NCOs are the enlisted non-commissioned officers, and they have a lot of responsibility for the enlisted members. Obviously, the chain of command is a big deal, because if there is ever a reason that they needed to go into combat, you can't have different people making different decisions. And so, you know, there's orders that are involved, and while they will listen and consider other avenues, once an active duty member is given an order, they are required to follow that, and it's enforced. So looking at the different things between enlisted versus officers, enlisted requirements are a high school diploma. They are responsible for completing the missions, carrying out the orders, and then the officers requires at least a 4-year degree, if not more, and they're responsible in then managing and then planning the missions. And then just some different information about the different branches. We are Air Force, so our members are called airmen. They even call civilians airmen. Their values are integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. Army members are called soldiers, and it's about loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. Marine Corps members are called Marines. Their values are honor, courage, and commitment. Navy members are called sailors, but they also have the same values as Marines. And then the Coast Guard is seen as a separate branch, but they have the same values as the Navy does. Okay, next slide. So special considerations when working with military families. You know, military families serve right along with the active duty members. They have to go to the different assignments. They have to adjust to the military member being gone. So really, the military member and the families all serve and make a lot of sacrifices to serve our country. And just some information about some unique stressors related to working with military families, or actually unique stressors for them, but knowledge of that in relation to working with them. So they do work long hours. Unlike civilians, they don't have a set 8-10 hour day. They will stay as long as command expects them to stay, and sometimes, depending on the situation, that could be a lot of hours. And that obviously requires then the family to adjust to that. And a lot of times, if the spouse is in active duty as well, then they take a lot of brunt. If there's children involved, having to arrange for all of that, it's very difficult for spouses to sometimes work, because depending on what the active duty member's job is, They might have to, you know, be really flexible in taking care of the kids or doing what they have to do to make sure that things are taken care of at the home front. They move a lot. Obviously, that has multiple implications, but you know, having to uproot frequently can be difficult, as well as just even knowing kind of the different resources in the community to reach out if you're needing help for certain things. And then marriage and parenting. So active duty members tend to get married younger and parent younger. There is some incentives for that. You know, if they're dating somebody and they're being moved to a different base, if they're not married, then you know, they can't get orders for that other person to go. There's also some financial perks about doing that. As you know, so they'll get more money if they're married or if they have children. It could mean the difference between having to live in a dorm. The military provides extra money for them to live in housing. And so if they are married and have children, they are going to get more money to live in housing, whether they choose to do that on or off base. So there's, you know, some financial incentives and some really just operational incentives to get married more at a younger age, as well as I think that the next bullet takes into consideration that there's some social isolation. So some of them are very young. For the first time, they may be away from their family. And so there's some incentive to really, you know, start building that family and have that unit of support for yourself. Deployments, obviously there's a lot, you know, a lot of issues that can come with that. Having to be gone for long periods of time. Again, the same kind of thing where the other members of the family kind of have to step in and take care of things. And really just transitioning back after a deployment can be very difficult, just getting back to the routine, getting back to the regular responsibilities involved in civilian life and the family life. And that's separate even from if there are any mental health issues that might develop. Like we know that if they see combat, they might be more, or if they just even see some tragic things, which they do oftentimes when they're deployed, they can develop PTSD. And we know from a domestic violence abuse standpoint that they are 2/3 more likely to engage in some type of domestic abuse if they also have a PTSD diagnosis. So looking at disciplinary issues. So looking back at the conversation I was having with you, the previous slide about the values of the Air Force. So in any military, any branch, they're really expected to live by those values, and not doing so could mean disciplinary issues. So, you know, if I do something outside of my workplace or something that involves my family, I'm not going to get disciplined at work for that. But military members can get disciplined for that under the umbrella of not upholding the values that they are supposed to as being a service member. Mental health stigma. There is a lot of stigma about mental health issues. Again, kind of same thinking about that is that can end up getting them discharged from the military. And so they tend to be more private. They don't really necessarily talk openly about the things that they're struggling with, either themselves or with their family, because of concerns about how it will impact their career. Legal considerations. So looking specifically at domestic violence, if a crime is committed on base, then the military has complete jurisdiction. If something was to happen off base, then the state has jurisdiction, and a lot of times then the military will request to get jurisdiction from the state. And so, and then being able to handle it internally. So, you know, that they're usually pretty good about letting it transfer over to the federal side, but not always. There's sometimes a struggle about that. Federal punitive actions are typically more stringent than what state is. And then once a case gets transferred over to the military side, then they can handle it a couple of different ways. They can, again, go back up to the disciplinary action. They can handle it that way, or they can make a decision to actually prosecute it within the military standards. And the last bullet I have is just women in the military. As women that become more active in the military front, we have seen a lot of increase in sexual harassment and sexual assault allegations. The military really is come a long ways, I think, about being zero tolerance about that, but there is a hesitancy to report those issues. A lot of times I think it goes unreported. Not I think, I know that it goes unreported. Either they are concerned about retaliation, or that nothing will actually be done about it. And so we know there's a lot of women who have been victims of assault and haven't reported it to us. All right, next slide. All right, so diving specifically into what we do for family advocacy. So we are a Department of Defense program. We receive our money from Congress. And there is a version of us at every installation, no matter what branch of the military. And basically what we are basically the experts on base to handle any kind of family maltreatment. So that involves obviously domestic violence or abuse, but also any kind of child maltreatment also belongs to us. And then most recently, they have given us oversight on child-on-child sexual behavior, mostly because that didn't really, there wasn't an agency on base that really owned that. And we wanted to make sure that children that were engaging in that kind of behavior, from obviously the alleged offender to the victim, that they had a clinical person that could help get them plugged into appropriate services. The mission for family advocacy is really about prevention. We try to prevent these cases from coming across our door in the first place. That's really what we're trying to do. But when it does, then we're focused on doing rehabilitation and looking at the family holistically and trying to figure out what we need to do for the family to contribute to the overall well-being of the unit. Okay, next slide. All right, so just looking at some definitions, this is how Department of Defense defines domestic abuse and domestic violence. Domestic abuse is really maltreatment that's not physical. So we're talking about sexual there. If it's not physical, more of the emotional, psychological abuses will happen there. And then the domestic violence, we're looking more at when there is physical violence or a threat thereof. Any acts of domestic violence are addressed on the Uniform Code of Military Justice if the military has jurisdiction, like we spoke earlier, or according to state law, depending on what who has the jurisdiction and who is prosecuting at that point. And next slide. So this is specifically what we're looking at for physical abuse. So it's just important to note that there doesn't have to be any injuries for us to say that a physical abuse case has occurred. So really reading through all of that, it is mostly things that involve physical force. However, we do have a few things that are there that aren't that. The poisoning is there. Holding underwater is considered physical abuse. And anytime anybody brandishes any kind of weapon, we consider that a physical abuse case. All right, next slide. So looking at emotional and verbal abuse, this is, behaviors that don't necessarily, they leave a scar, but there's no physical touch. So looking at those definitions, any kind of name calling, putting down, trying to embarrass them on purpose, controlling their ability to come and go freely, any kind of stalking behavior, isolating them, so trying to, keep them from having contact with friends or family, using any kind of online social media or cell phones to control or intimidate them, interrogating them. That's really more related to infidelity, questioning them. Well, where you been? Who you talking to? We've had cases where they have to take a picture in front of wherever where they say they're at to prove that they're there, or just kind of calling a military member just like crazy, like just on and on and on, questioning, what are they doing? Why aren't you calling me back? That type of thing. Any kind of intimidation is considered emotional abuse. Any kind of threats to harm them or their pets. Some of the things we see with that too is, I'm going to take your children away from you. I'm going to kill myself if you leave me. Sometimes there's threats to, I'm going to, make up false allegations to hurt your military career. All of that would be under emotional. Any kind of restriction to their access to financial resources or basic needs. And like I said in the slide, sometimes spouses cannot work because of just the nature of what the active duty member's job is. But yet, they might try to restrict their access to money. Well, I'm the one that makes the money, and therefore you can't have access. We would run that as an emotional abuse case. And then really just kind of anything that would be questioning their credibility, saying that they're crazy, trying to really ruin their reputation, because the military can be a pretty small community, especially when people live on base. And so just like a small town, rumors get around, and really, any kind of attempt to disparage somebody or make the reputation bad on base could be seen as an emotional case. All right, next slide. No questions? Has there not been any questions, Teresa?
No questions just yet. Just a lot of people introducing themselves, and
oh, good. Okay.
It's nice to see everybody join in.
Great. All right. So looking at partner sexual abuse, that's any unwanted forced emotional or physical sexual activity. So you can look at the definitions there. It's pretty self-explanatory. The interesting thing about when we run cases that are physical or emotional, for it to meet criteria, and I'll talk more specifically what that process looks like, but we have our own internal process in the military when we're looking at these abuse cases. And in the physical and emotional side, we not only have to prove that an incident occurred, but we also have to show that that incident has some kind of impact on our victim. And that is different in regards to sexual abuse cases. When we have a sexual abuse case, all we have to do is show enough information that a sexual abuse actually occurred. There is no impact questions. It's implied that if we think that sexual abuse happened to a partner, then they in fact had impact, and it doesn't even go into any kind of detailed questions about that. All right, next slide. All right, as I said, I'm not going to go into this as much, but we also handle child maltreatment cases. These are the different definitions for that. And looking, physical, same kind of things that we were talking about with the partner. The only other difference that you might see with the child is if there's a domestic violence situation and, the child is young and the parent is holding the child, and the physical abuse is happening to, that spouse, then the child could be in imminent danger, and we would run that as also a child physical maltreatment case. In the case where the child isn't in imminent danger, then we would do it as a child emotional maltreatment case. But anytime we see children witness any kind of domestic violence or abuse, we run a child emotional maltreatment case, as well as making sure that we report that information to the Children, Youth, and Families Department for the state. Other things that with the child you might see is maybe they favor the other child, or they do things deliberately to make that child feel bad, or not part of the family. Child sexual maltreatment, when we get cases like that, we are required very quickly to engage with our investigative unit on base, as well as lawyers, and figure out an immediate safety plan for that child. And then neglect, is really kind of everything outside of those things when the child's needs are not being taken care of. We also, surprisingly enough, have dirty houses, even on base. And whenever we have any kind of dirty house, it might be hazardous to a child, we would run that as a neglect case as well. We have a memorandum of understanding with CYFD, so anytime that they're working with a military family, they don't have to get a release of information to talk to us. We can openly share information and work together on cases, not only through the investigative process, but also regarding treatment and making plans about how to treat the family. So next slide. All right, so for somebody to be eligible for our services, they have to be active duty in any branch. Really where they would get their services has to be where they're assigned, and or special arrangements can be made with other bases if maybe the family is separated or there's some other kind of mitigating circumstances there. Activated Guard and Reserve members and their family members also can receive our services, but they have to be activated. So normally they do not receive our services unless they're on active orders. Pretty much the definition of being able to receive our care is they are eligible for care at a military hospital. Military retirees can receive voluntary prevention and treatment services if we have space available for them to do so. And then Coast Guard families or military public health officers, which is just a really separate, different piece of the military related to the medical field. They can receive initial safety planning with us, but then really we refer them out to the community for any services that they could need. All right, next slide. All right, so just looking at some of our stats, and this is all pre-COVID. I'm gonna, context that. We have no idea what things look like during the COVID period of time here. But in fiscal year 2018, military-wide, we had 16,912 reported incidences of domestic abuse. About half of those met our clinical definition of abuse. And we'll talk more about what that means in some later slides. But those ones that met criteria, so basically, the definitions that we talked about before, the panel that looked at that case felt like there was enough information to meet the threshold of abuse. Of those cases in fiscal year 2018, physical abuse was 74% of those cases. And that doesn't mean that that's primarily the abuse that occurs. It's just the easiest to really kind of show impact from. When we're talking about emotional abuse cases, that's a little bit more of a gray area. And those cases, it's a little bit more difficult for them to meet criteria. And in the sexual abuse cases, like we said before, that's probably underreported, so we don't get as many of those cases. Despite slight fluctuations, rates of spouse abuse have been pretty stable over the past 10 years. We haven't seen really an increase or decrease. But I will tell you, during the period of COVID, so our referrals are way down, and we know that something is wrong about that. Because I know that you guys in the community are seeing a lot more cases. And so I don't think that it's because there aren't cases happening in our military homes. I think that they're just more hesitant to report it right now. And that's very concerning to me. But what I can tell you is we've seen the cases that we are getting, or the referrals that we are getting, are pretty bad cases. So not involving deaths or anything, but just even within the last month, we've gotten 2 cases at Kirtland that have involved strangulation. And so that's not normal for us to get such high-risk cases in such a short period of time. And so I don't know what that means moving forward, if we're going to start seeing, more of that or not. But it had been a period of really not seeing much to seeing some cases that were pretty concerning for risk. All right, next question. Next slide. All right, more trends. So looking at the number of intimate partner abuse incidences, that's also been stable. Difference between, intimate partner, the way that the military defines an intimate partner is anybody that they might share a residence with or a child with, or even like a dating partner. So if they've had any kind of sexual relationship at all, it's defined as an intimate partner for us. Talking about the sexual abuse incidences, it increased for between 2009 and 17, but we've really seen a decrease since then. And then as a total for fiscal year 2018, we had 15 domestic abuse fatalities as military as a whole for that particular year. All right, next slide. All right, so we really rely a lot on different agencies. We cannot do this work alone. It takes really just a system approach to address these issues. So all the circles there in the purple are all military related agencies. So you've got us at Family Advocacy, the Active Duty MEMS Command. When you look over in the community, we have, an Air Force community, we have different agencies on base that do different things, but then we're linked obviously to also things in the larger community. So any kind of divorce proceedings or child custody issues are going to be heard in family court. Any kind of child maltreatment cases, the state agency is the one that does all the investigating. We don't investigate those cases. They have complete jurisdiction over cases involving military members. Shelters. So we are completely and totally reliant on the community to provide shelter for some of our victims. A lot of times we can try to figure out a different plan, and we can, get the active duty member in the dorm, et cetera. But sometimes that, the risk to the victim is too high, and we don't want the offender to know where the victim is. And so we have to rely on shelters to help us out with that. And then the Child Advocacy Centers. So AllFace is the Child Advocacy Center here in Albuquerque. We rely on them a lot to, treat our children or the problematic sexual behavior of youth. We refer a lot of our cases there. The chaplains, so really providing that support from the spiritual religious side. We have lawyers on base. They provide that support, then military police. And then, of course, they interact with civilian police if things are happening in the community. A lot of active duty members don't reside on base. So the charges might come from civilian police. And then looking at healthcare. So especially, all of our bases here, we just have outpatient services. We don't have inpatient hospitals. And so we rely a lot on the community to provide specialist services. If they have to be hospitalized, any kind of urgent care or emergent care is all done in the community. All right, so next slide.
We do have a question.
Oh, yay.
From Lisa Chavez. Thanks, Lisa. She's asking, how are you handling things now with COVID-19 and all the restrictions and regulations?
It's a very good question. So it has been interesting. So we were never approved to telework before. So it was, you have to be in the office. And so we have had to be really, really quick to try to provide services virtually. And it's been a challenge. So for the most part, we are providing most of our treatment clinical services online, unless for some reason we feel like that is not appropriate or not safe for our victims to do so. But anytime we get a new referral, we are still doing face-to-face contact in those cases, as well as, kind of children cases. So like for Dirty House, I can't really assess that virtually. And so we're going into the homes and doing that kind of thing. So, So, we're figuring it out as we go, but we really are trying to provide as much services online as we can, given COVID. Great. Thanks for the question. Everyone else, feel free to chime in if you have any. All right. I said earlier, we really are focused on prevention. I think people hear our name and think about the maltreatment side of the house, but we would be very happy to put the maltreatment side of the house out of business if we could. And so we work really hard, not just with our agency, but also with different agencies on base to prevent any kind of maltreatment from ever occurring in the first place. And so we have two different components on our prevention side. The first one I'm going to talk about is what's our intervention specialist is called. That is an independently licensed social worker position. And so they can provide individual and couple counseling. They also do a lot of education about domestic abuse and child maltreatment. All commanders are required to do training yearly about domestic violence and abuse. And they provide that kind of training as well to all the agencies on base. And if we have a certain unit that's seeing specific issues, we can also go in and do briefings and education to them. As on a regular basis. So back to your question about the COVID, we've also been learning how to try to provide a lot more of these classes online. But what we do provide is parenting classes. That's Love and Logic, if some of you are familiar with that curriculum. That is what we provide to members on base. We do some stress and anger management classes. The couple communication or relationship enhancement uses a specific curriculum as well. All of it is evidence-based. We cannot provide any type of treatment that we cannot, or curriculum that's not got some research as being evidence-based. So that curriculum is called PrEP. Any of you guys familiar with that? Or you could look it up. I mean, it might be some programs that you would want to look at implementing as well with your agencies. And then any kind of divorce recovery support, we also try to provide services regarding that. So caveat at the bottom, different programs vary across installations as far as what they provide. We really try to, the needs of the different populations vary depending on, what's available in the community, what's not, and just kind of the stressors that are unique to each base. So each program really tries to provide programs based on whatever the needs of the population are. All right, next slide. All right, so we just talked about the evidence-based. They have to get services from us, be showing some kind of risk factors for family maltreatment. And our new parent support program is one of the best programs that we have in the Air Force. It is actually a nurse who provides a home visitation program. So they go into the homes. Really, it is whatever the family feels like they need. Her eligible population is anybody that has, any pregnancy all the way up to 36 months. And they come up with a service plan, and really she just case manages that, helps provide maybe education around appropriate developmental milestones with the child. Can help get them, resources as far as WIC, if they're needing extra, finances to help support the child. She's also a lactation. She's certified in lactation, so she can help with breastfeeding. Really just a great program. And again, she's very knowledgeable about things in the community, so she can make referrals to anybody in the community to try to help. They complete a screener that basically has risk factors for child or partner maltreatment, and it comes out with the score. It's either high needs or low needs. If they're high needs, and there is a requirement that she see them at least twice a month. All right. Great. So in our prevention programs, really, these are our goals. That's based on what we know are resiliency factors for families. and the best way to treat some of the risk factors. So we're really trying to help them, especially with the military, the healthy relationships when they're so far away from family and friends. They're really more dependent on each other. Having that healthy relationship and that support system within the immediate family unit is very important. Giving them resiliency skills and positive alternatives, any kind of education we can give them to influence any kind of change in their life. Shared responsibility, making sure that there is, they're taking responsibility, and also, sharing that responsibility with their spouse. Support them engaging in services when needed, being willing to talk about what's happening in their family, and willing to engage in any kind of services that would help. Obviously, the best referrals are the self-referrals, not the ones that are mandated because of some kind of incident has happened. So really just trying to work on that mental health stigma, and encouraging them to reach out and get services before it becomes a big issue. And then obviously we're trying to reduce any kind of severity, frequency of abusive incidences, both with partner maltreatment and child. All right, next slide.
We do have a question from Diana.
Okay. Hi, Diana.
What help is
there? Talking to the black screen.
I know, right?
Hi, Diana.
So her question is, what help is there for the civilian family if it is found that the military personnel is the abuser and might face jail or loss of employment?
Good question. So if we're looking at some kind of punitive standard that happens, there is a fund that gives them some money to basically establish themselves if they need to. It's not a lot of money, but there is a fund that's available if the active duty member is losing their job. It's primarily geared at victims who are trying to leave that individual because of the abusive behavior, and they're trying to establish themselves, and build on their lives and leave and go to a different community, etc. The military does have special funding to help those victims do that.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so when going over to the maltreatment side of the house, this is where we normally get our referrals. Most of our referrals do come from either law enforcement or commanders because they become aware of a situation, or CYFD is what we consider child services. So anytime a statewide central intake report is made and they know it involves a military family, we are cross-referenced. We get a copy of what the allegations are, so we know right away that what the allegations are and that have been made against an active duty member. Domestic abuse victim advocates. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but there are certain bases that have victim advocates assigned to their family advocacy program that just works with the victim, a lot like you guys do in the community. Both Cannon and Holloman do have a victim advocate. Kirtland does not. I'm a little salty about that, but they've been promising me one for a couple years. It is a huge service. We do need one. They're 24/7. That's a very important service that we can offer our victims. We just don't have it in Albuquerque right now. So again, like we turn to the community if we have a victim that really needs that, and try to ask for help to get some advocacy for them. Self-referral, I mean, that happens sometimes, but pretty rare. They do not refer themselves to us on the maltreatment side of the house. Primary care provider, refer if anything comes up during their appointments, as well as mental health provider. And just a caveat on that, if it is a referral that is not made by the top three, so if a referral comes to us that's not made by law enforcement, CYFD, or command, we do have the ability to offer a restricted report. And basically what that means is that we can offer clinical services, you know, to our victim if they don't want command to be aware, or they don't want it to go any further. We do have that ability. The only thing that we cannot do is if we assess them to be at a high risk. Obviously, safety comes before anything else, and we have to, you know, involve command or law enforcement. But like for emotional maltreatment cases, we can absolutely offer a restricted report if they would prefer that. Okay. So this is what happens. So we get an allegation of child maltreatment or partner maltreatment, and notifications are made immediately. So if we're not getting it from these agencies, then we're making sure that they're aware that we have received. Again, this is not a restricted report. This is we get an unrestricted report. So we have to notify any kind of police agent. I mean, yes, any investigative agencies on base. We basically have 2. OSI and security forces. And then any kind of child maltreatment case, we have to make sure CYFD is aware. And then if the commander for sergeant doesn't already know, we call and make them aware as well. I talked about before, we have a memorandum of understanding with CYFD. I feel like we have probably a really good one here. It is pretty in depth. It allows for a lot, as well as, you know, part of what I'm doing here today is really trying to build those relationships with community. And I've really been, that's a huge goal of mine as somebody who's worked in the community. I think it's really important to do that. And we've also been working with CYFD on that. So I've done a couple of trainings for them as well, trying to build that bridge. Okay, so the MOU, we've already talked more about that. I don't think there's anything additional to share. We do collaboratively safety plan with them as needed. And all of our services in the military are free to the families. There's no charge, there's no billing to insurance. Our funding comes from Congress, and there is no insurance involved in it. Next slide. Okay, so when we get a referral, we sign them up for a clinical intake. We do an intake on both the offender and the victim. In a partner case, child cases, we can interview the child, but typically, unless we're doing it in conjunction with CYFD, we don't, because we don't want to interview the child twice. So we rely on their information. But in domestic violence and abuse cases, we try to interview both the offender and the victim. Any active duty member, the commander requires them, so they get the order to come to our office for the assessment. They have no choice about coming. Civilians do have a choice. We cannot mandate civilians to come in for an assessment, but we can highly encourage, and I mean, for the most part, they come. It's surprisingly enough, they actually, we don't have a huge issue with them not being willing to come. Anybody who may have collateral information, a neighbor or a friend or a family member, we can interview them, find out what they know about the incident that occurred. Anybody within the medical group that has information, we don't have to have any kind of release to do that. If they're seeing like a therapist or somebody in the community, we do have to have a release of information to do that, but we do attempt to make that contact. We review all their medical records, kind of see what the history is, any kind of risk indicators there that need to be addressed. We complete the Intimate Partner Physical Injury Risk Assessment Tool, which I'm going to be calling the IPI-RAT, because that's really just a mouthful to say. And I'm going to tell you guys more about that. That's an interesting tool that we use. We only use it in physical abuse cases, but it was actually developed by a university, and it's a tool they use to indicate specific factors that are if they're present, could predict another incident of partner violence is going to occur. So next slide. So these are the details about our IPI-RAT. So these are the specific items that they look at to make that determination that they are a risk for another incident. So if there's any injury that occurs, and basically each one of these, they can get 1 point. So each one of these gets 1 point. So cause a minor injury, they would get a point for that. Ever choked or strangled their partner, they get a point for that. Although I'm gonna say to y'all, if I get that information, I'm already thinking they're high risk, because we know that any kind of strangulation has 7 times more the chance of having some kind of fatality in the end. So we really take those cases very, very seriously. If the offender is denying, oh, nothing happened, no, that didn't happen, oh, you know, they're just lying. If we're seeing kind of a pattern where the severity is increasing or it's happening more often, they're blaming other people for what happened, any kind of attempts to control their access to friends, family, or resources. There have been incidences of aggression in the past. They're feeling desperate about the relationship. We know if they feel like that relationship is about to end, that can escalate the violence and potential fatality of a situation. Any kind of emotional abuse towards a partner, ever using any kind of threats to use weapons against them, whether or not they actually had the firearm or not, even just threatening to use weapons is going to give them a point. Any kind of ideas they're expressing or opinions that justify violence towards their partner, any kind of indications, oh, well, they deserved it, or if they wouldn't do this, I wouldn't do these things, we'll give them a point for that. And any kind of unrealistic expectations of their partner, will give them a point for that. All right, next slide. So these are what the victim items look like. So if we have a victim who's dissatisfied with the military lifestyle, so you know, it's very difficult. The military lifestyle can be very difficult, and if they feel dissatisfied with it, we know that there's, you know, some pretty chronic stressors, and this is not a situation where their spouse can just, you know, quit the military. Like somebody would quit their job, but they can't do that. And so we know that probably the stress within the relationship is increased if we have a victim who's very dissatisfied with being a military spouse. Oh, can you go back? There. Attempting to leave the relationship. We know they're at higher risk for that. If they vocalize any kind of fear for themselves, their children, or their pets, we give them a point for that. And then in the total, you can look down here, they'll come out to lower moderate. Really, you can only have one of those marked to be lower moderate. And what the research says is that if they score in the low to moderate, they have 1 out of 10 chance to have a subsequent physical incident. If they're coming out between the 2 and 7, that's high, they have a 1 out of 3. And if they're coming out very high, which is a score of 8 or more, we know that, you know, basically the 2 out of 3 chances that they're going to have another incident. So the very high incidence we have, anything that scores in the very high range, we have a special process that we invoke for that. That should be on the next slide. Do we have questions? Are we okay?
Yes, we're okay.
Okay. So in any of those levels, we do any kind of risk assessment. So when we first get the referral, we do a initial safety plan. And then after we have completed all the intakes, we do another safety plan. It's a little bit more comprehensive. If they are scoring in the high or very high range, we can make a recommendation for what's called a military no contact order. It's basically like a restraining order that the military issues. And the active duty member, if they're the offender, faces disciplinary action if they violate that no contact order. And I just learned recently that apparently our military police can put that in the system where the community police have access to it and would know that there is a military no contact order, so they didn't necessarily have to go and file a restraining order as well, which is nice because a lot of times they're hesitant to do the restraining order. In the military no contact order, we can make a recommendation for and enforce with whether the victim is requesting that or not. And then with very high cases, we do what's called a high risk for violence response team. It's called a HRVRT. I think that's on the next slide. You can go ahead and switch think we talked more about that. Can you go, yeah, there you go. So this is activated when we feel like not only is there a serious threat for harm for any kind of family member, but if we have a staff member that we feel like might be in harm's way, we can also activate this HRVRT as well. Basically what it is a multidisciplinary team. It can include, community members if they're working with the family, but it's mostly our staff, any kind of mental health provider on base. We have an attorney from the legal office, any investigators from law enforcement, and the commander is there. The victim is also invited, and it really is a comprehensive multidisciplinary approach to providing safety for the victim. After we deem a case as high risk, we have to have weekly contact with the offender, the victim, and command until we deem the risk level has come down. All right, so after we do all of that, we actually send it to our Incident Determination Committee. So this is the committee that reviews all the information that we've been able to gather about the incident, and they're the ones that make the decision based on the definitions that we looked at and whether or not there was impact if a case meets criteria or it doesn't. If a case meets criteria, then the Air Force has this data bank that they use, and the case goes into that data bank. And the purpose of that is several factors. Because military families move around so much, I mean, I can only look in our system about cases that happened here at Kirtland. But anytime we get a new referral, we do a check to see if they've had similar patterns of behavior at other bases, to really kind of, use that in our assessment about needs and risk. Also, if a person is found to meet criteria for child abuse, then it prevents them from working in our child development centers. So that's another reason for the data bank. And the third reason is that if we have a family that has a lot of issues, there are certain places certain bases, we don't want to send those families because they don't have the services that that family would need. And so that's another reason that we keep that data bank, so that, again, people can access, and not people, family advocacy staff, only us can access that. But we have that information about what's happened at other bases to make those determinations for families. All right, so as far as the Incident Determination Committee, all branches have this. In the Air Force, we specifically call this committee the Central Registry Board, or the CRB is what we would determine, we would call it. What it is it's an automated decision tree. It's got an algorithm. So it's kind of, if any of you guys have ever read those stories where, like, depending on what you choose, depends on where it goes as far as, the story, that's kind of how this is. So depending on how the voting happens, then it brings up other decisions for the committee to consider. If a case meets criteria, so basically everyone votes, they raise their hands. There's 7 people typically on the committee. It is chaired by the second in command at the installation, so we really have that level of authority at the table to make sure that the protocol of the committee is followed. Sometimes we have active duty member offenders who, is very well liked, and their commander is very supportive of them. And so that provides us that oversight if we need to kind of make sure that we're holding that commander in check, that just because somebody is good at their job or well liked doesn't mean that they did not do some type of family maltreatment. Other people that sit at the table, so I am there. We have somebody from the legal office there, somebody from security forces, and then we have senior enlisted members, again, to provide kind of that oversight, and then the commander is there as well. Next slide. All right, so as far as interventions that we provide, so any case that goes to the Central Registry Board, whether or not we think that it actually goes over into some type of maltreatment or not, we meet as a clinical team and we make recommendations for services. Really, the difference is if it didn't meet criteria, it's a recommendation. So the family can decide whether or not to seek out those services or not. But if it meets criteria, then it is a mandated, at least for the active duty member. So if the active duty member is the offender, they are command mandated to do the interventions that we see fit. If it is a civilian, we cannot mandate them to do so, but if they don't engage in interventions, we close the case, which is called unresolved. And basically what that means is in that data bank that I was referencing earlier, if they're trying to send them to certain locations, they're not going to allow that civilian offender to accompany that active duty member to certain locations. So a lot of times that's enough incentive for that civilian spouse to engage in services with us. All right, so intervention services for the offender and the victim. We have safety planning. We provide individual counseling, group counseling, and/or marriage counseling. If an incident involves any kind of alcohol or substance abuse and that person is active duty, we can provide a referral to our substance abuse specific program. It is also command mandated for them to participate and address any kind of alcohol or substance abuse issues. We provide case management. For the offender only, we offer the VISTA program and the Change Step program, which I'm actually going to talk about in more detail in a minute. And then for the victim only, the victim advocates that I discussed before, we also have a special victims counsel. So that's a lawyer specifically on the base that handles cases to help victims negotiate, command or figure out how to, engage with command or the legal system or whatever is required. It is an attorney just for our victim to kind of help get them what they need. All right, so looking at the services we provide our offenders. So the Change Step program is our evidence-based program for our active duty male offenders who has a case that's met criteria at the CRB. It was developed by a program called the Domestic Violence Project. It was a community program that adapted their curriculum specifically to military members. They had a couple of people on staff who were actually previous military that helped develop that curriculum to make it more appropriate for our active duty males. You can see the mission. Obviously, it's to kind of stop any domestic violence from occurring and to break the cycle of violence. And I'm going to go more into details about what topics we cover in that program. So next slide. All right, so it's repair oriented. Basically, it's not supposed to be punitive. It lasts 24 weeks. They are, depending, really it's scheduled 2 hours a week. They are expected to attend, and it incorporates, kind of ideas about military culture, the structures, and really kind of enhancing their engagement with one another. Providing kind of that peer engagement and interaction and really accountability and responsibility. So next slide. All right, so this is what the program looks like. As far as application, they have to sign an agreement to participate. There are 11 topics. We already talked about the 24 2-hour weekly. In addition to the group, they are required to do at least once a month individual sessions. We have handouts that we provide them to take home. They have 3 major assignments they have to complete during the curriculum. They have to do a self-control plan. Really that is looking at cues at a low level, a moderate level, and a high level right before they're about to be abusive, so that they're starting to develop some insight about themselves and kind of the triggers as well as the signs within their bodies and things that they're saying to indicate to them that they are about to become abusive. So that they know that they can, when they need to appropriately take a timeout or intervene. They have to have an assignment where they have to take responsibility for the abuse that occurred. And then the maintenance plan for when they're done, how they will continue to maintain, make nonviolent choices. Next slide. It is an open group. And so we have these gateway sessions every 6 weeks. And in the gateway sessions, when we are opening it up for new members to come in, we obviously have to go through the group rules again, cover the cycle of violence. If we have more senior group members, we can ask them to provide that information. We go specifically into definitions of abusive behaviors, give them an overall detailed information about what the program's going to look like, and then really kind of talk about absences and what that looks like and the expectations for attendance. All right, next slide. All right, so this is what our sessions look like. A domestic violence 101 is really just an overview of the program. It gives definitions about what abuse is, talks about the philosophy that using violence is a learned behavior, and then goes into real specifics about definitions or indicators of abuse in all the categories that we talked about, like physical, sexual, emotional. They break it out into emotional and psychological, and then technological is also in there as well. And the second session, it talks about costs and payoffs of abusive behavior. This is always kind of an interesting thing to have them talk about payoffs, because I don't know that they necessarily realize, but there's a reason they engage in abusive behavior, and really exploring what the payoff is for engaging in that type of behavior and recognizing that. And then also outlining, the payoffs are typically more short-term and the costs are more long-term, and exploring that to a deeper degree. Third session is about owning and blaming, really talking about the definition of shame and how it can be a barrier to real change. Looking at defense mechanisms and denial, and how all those can be barriers to shame, and then giving them some tools about okay, well, what's the difference between shame and guilt, and how do you kind of journey out of the path of shame and more into taking responsibility and feeling bad or remorse for what you did, but willing to make changes. The ABCs of thinking and feeling are really looking at a cognitive model. So something happens, they have beliefs about what happened, their feelings or their thoughts about what happened, and based on those feelings or thoughts, there's consequences for that. And really having them explore kind of their belief system and how they channel that, what happened, into that belief system, and how sometimes when that's negative, the consequence might be different as if they kind of redefined it and looked at it differently. We explore communication styles like passive aggressive, assertive, and then really giving them more of the tools to look at how they can communicate in more of an assertive type fashion. All right, next slide. More about how to take responsibility and be assertive. Culture of origins part 1 and 2 are really looking at the military culture as well as a culture about being man in our society, and what that means and what they're taught about not only their gender, but the female gender as well, and how that can contribute to abuse in the relationship. And then we really start putting some things into place as far as, okay, what do you need to do? How do you change this controlling behavior, these threats? Really taking a self-inventory about the things that they're doing and things that they need to change. Looking at how much anger and stress they have, how they're handling their anger, how to do it differently, things that they can do with anger. Basically, there's a handout about do's and don'ts. When you're angry, how to handle anger, making sure that they understand anger is a normal emotion. It's really the behavior that goes along with it that becomes a concern. Look at how to manage stress in a better, productive way. And then the last topic for them is looking at how their violence with their spouse, what that kind of effect that has on their children, and looking at it from a developmental perspective on, depending on the age of the child, kind of certain things that you can see. All right, so the next curriculum I want to talk about is our VISTA curriculum, which is very interesting. So this is our curriculum for our women offenders. It came out of an agency that out of the Jersey Center for Nonviolence. It really isn't a curriculum for specific military members, but I mean, we've had female active duty members go through it, but it's not really based on any kind of military culture background. The curriculum came based on this specific agency's experience that most of the time when we have women that are using force in their relationship, it's really different than the men that are using force in their relationships. It's different as far as motivation, their intent and impact. And so what they were seeing was that generally women typically resort to that type of behavior to get some type of short-term control. And usually those are in the context of relationships that are abusive or controlling. So they're trying to gain control in a relationship. I mean, they're victims themselves. And they're looking at trying to get some type of control over that situation. Again, their motivation is not to be controlling typically like it is the men. And so the services has to be different. And what they were finding was that it was kind of a one size fits all, and that women were required to participate in these oh, I see a typo, that is for males, and it wasn't really appropriate because it really wasn't specific to their needs. And the worst, for some of them that were victims, it really was a type of re-victimization for them. So next slide. So just some more information about the program. So the women that were labeled as perpetrators of domestic violence, a lot of times they were denied restraining orders. It could affect their ability to secure employment. Shelters would not allow them to come even though they were victims themselves. And so it really was based on trying to be a healing place for the victims that are using force, but also, you know, having some accountability and focusing on choices that they're making to use violence in that relationship. Very much based on choice. Group members and facilitators are highly discouraged from advice giving. They can share their own experiences using I statements, but refraining from giving advice to the victims, as it's really about empowerment and victims making those choices and decisions for themselves. Next slide. So this is what it looks like. There's 22-hour sessions. It is also an open group. Because it's an open group, each session starts with just really talking about, you know, welcoming, introductions, that type of thing. It's based on an ecological model. Really, that's for social workers. That's a systems-based model, and looking at not only their behavior for themselves, but also how it affects the other systems in their life, including family, institution, community, societal experiences. So they do a welcome introduction, and then there are activities and handouts, and at the end there is time to do individual processing. Major assignments for this group include also doing kind of a history of force, you know, just like we do a inventory for the males, we do also with females. It just looks different. Looking at their areas of stress and how to cope with them. And then putting timeout plans in place and having them analyze how effective and how that's working. Next slide. So these are what the sessions look like. The first one is really about looking about who they are, defining themselves as far as roles and responsibilities, and then, you know, the reason for the referral and starting to take some accountability for that. I mean, you're going to see a lot of similarities, but just kind of different as far as the male and females looking at, you know, identifying what they've done and what the payoffs and consequences were. Same kind of thing there. Interestingly enough, on this curriculum, the effects of force and children and family, friends, and I love that they put pets in there as well. But it's done a lot earlier in the curriculum than it is. I mean, it's an open group, but it really is, you know, for people that are starting from the first session, it really is introduced earlier than it is for the men. I mean, it's the last session really for the men. If they're, you know, doing the standard sessions in order. Looking at relationship needs, really defining what they're needing from the relationship and how those needs are being met or not met. They also look at the cultural messages as women and what that means. Defense mechanisms are also discussed. Boundaries, which is that's a topic that is not in the men's curriculum, that is in the women's. Looking at their boundaries, what kind of boundaries they have, how those boundaries are serving them, whether or not they need to change their boundaries. Really just looking at kind of like, you know, unhealthy, they call it unhealthful. So they combine helpful and unhealthy, but what's working, what's not working, and is it a boundary issue, and are there better boundaries you can put into place? All right, next. Do a whole session just on anger with the men, the session on anger and stress is combined. Do a whole conversation about conflict management, releasing judgment, shame, looking at perceptions of what is strong and what is weak. Those are some very interesting group sessions. I mean, I remember working with one woman who had been the victim of child abuse. And she just did not want to see herself as a victim of domestic violence. And it really, you know, went to that as a child, just feeling like she was weak or having these expectations that she should have been doing something differently. And so it was really hard for her, you know, to find herself as a victim because she felt like being weak. And really kind of looking at those definitions and beliefs and redefining them. How to effectively express yourself, and then looking, like we talked about with the men, looking at what the signals of stress looks like, you know, in the body and behaviors, and then what are the indicators that it's starting to escalate for yourself. Okay, next. So like I said, a lot of the women who engage in this are also victims. So making sure that we're doing planning also, you know, around them as victims, but also with them as offenders, and how to create, you know, that safety, just hard for themselves, but once they start changing, that changes the dynamic in the relationship, and that could increase their risk. And really just kind of being proactive about discussing that, planning around it, and calling it out. Setting goals, really just setting their sights on how they see themselves, what they want to be in the future. Intimacy, relation, you know, issues, what that looked like before, maybe what that looks like now that they're making changes. Looking at what the indicators are of healthy relationships, because a lot of times, you know, they don't know that. You know, that's not a curriculum you get in school. It should be, but it's not. And so a lot of times people don't even realize some of these things that are unhealthy until, you know, they get some education around that. And then really gifts to yourself is about how they provide that self-care, how they take care of themselves, things that they can engage in, especially when times are stressful. All right, next slide. So all the interventions that we provide, we do what's called feedback-informed treatment. Again, it has to be evidence-based, it's client-centered, but basically every session they rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10 about how individually their well-being is. And then they give us feedback as clinicians about how we did, how our approach was, how the topics were, so that we can make sure that not only are we tracking are they changing, are things getting better for them? Hopefully they're feeling better as time goes through therapy versus worse, but also that they're giving us that feedback if there's something that we need to do differently or things that we need to change to make the treatment more impactful or relevant for them. It does appear to work. Like people that, offenders that participate in these programs do have a low recidivism rate. So, all right, next slide. All right, so that's just contact information for all the different bases at Kirtland, Clovis, and Alamogordo. That's all I got. Any questions anybody has that they didn't ask as we went through? A lot of information, but I was trying to make it, I know you guys all serve a different role, and I just wanted to try to make it relevant for everybody and what you might do for our community. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lesley, for taking the time to do this presentation. And we do always have a Q&A session. So I know that there were some questions throughout the training, so we appreciate that. For those of you watching, we still, if you still do have any questions, this would be a great time to ask it. Something that was lingering maybe earlier on into the presentation. As you guys think about those questions, I wanted to remind you guys that you guys will be getting a certificate right after this training. After completing the survey, if you guys can take a couple of minutes to complete the survey, that would be fantastic, just to let us know how we're doing and what trainings you would like in future and how these trainings are for you. We really appreciate your feedback. And let's see, so we do have some things in the chat. So Diana, thank you. She stated, thank you, because we do come across military personnel and sometimes we do not have knowledge of all the services that are provided, which is very true.
Yes.
And Lourdes just wants to say thank you for the information, and it was a great
Yes.
Question.
Thank you guys, and thank you for your participation. And feel free to contact our offices if you're working with a family, and you need more information. I mean, really, like I said, this is about building those relationships with the community, because it's just so important. I think military communities can kind of isolate themselves a little bit, but we're so much better when we're working with the community and really, doing a holistic approach, especially because, like I said, I mean, sometimes they're hesitant to report to us for obvious reasons. It could have a career impact. And if they are the sole provider for the family, like, I get it. Like, as a victim, you might be hesitant to contact us, where they might be way more likely to reach out to you for help. And so just having that relationship with you guys and making sure that they know about it, we're not the only source of support, that there are other support in the community, and feeling comfortable to reach out to those supports is really vital, especially for our victims, but for our offenders too. I mean, ultimately, it's about them getting help.
So I do have a question. I know that
Sure.
We're nearing the time for 12:30. So in regards to restraining orders, say that they don't live on base and they attain a restraining order off base. How does that protect them on base? Or do the military personnel, honor that restraining order that was given by the Second Judicial here in Albuquerque?
They do. And they have the ability to pull up any of that information, warrants or restraining orders or whatever. They are in the same system as the police to be able to do that. But if we know that there's a restraining order in place, there's usually a military no contact order in place too. I mean, usually it would be weird for there to be a restraining order and not one. They usually go hand in hand. The restraining orders are more victim initiated. The military no contact orders aren't. Really, it is based on our recommendation and command's decision on whether or not they want to put that into place. And a lot of times it is against what the offender and the victim want.
Gotcha.
But they do have the ability to see that. And again, if we know that's in place, we're probably going to make sure that we have a military protective order in place as well. The restraining order, I like to have both. I think it puts them in a better position, especially if they're living out in the community, to be protected, because they have both, but victims aren't necessarily always willing to do that. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering that. And
Sure.
it is 12:27, and so with that being said, we completed the training. Thanks so much.
I know it was a lot of information. I just wanted to make sure to give you guys as many tools as I so appreciate the opportunity.
our organizations definitely need it, and you know,
Hopefully post-COVID world, we'll actually get to meet in person, you know?
yes, hopefully in future we will, but any
Yeah.
information that you have to offer, we greatly value it. And just for those organizations that are watching right now throughout the state of New Mexico, they are currently applying to be members. And so we're hoping to have them after our board meets and getting that approval. And so if you guys would like to get in contact with Lesley, if it's okay with her, I can put that information in the email that I will be sending
Absolutely.
you. Survey.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Anything that comes up later, please feel free to call me.
Perfect. So you'll complete the survey, and then I'll issue out your certificates in the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that. And if you are missing a certificate from a prior Advocacy Cafe or training session, please also let me know at terry@nmcadv.org, or you can also send it to training@nmcadv.org. But other than that, guys, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and take care of yourself during these very trying, difficult times. Make sure that you guys are getting your self-care in, and finding some way to de-stress, whether either walking, going outside, getting some sunshine. But if you guys do need anything, please contact me at the coalition. I'm here to support you. And thank you, Lesley. Again, I cannot say how appreciative we are of you being here and giving us the information. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Take care.